TitleMatchNetwork.com.
What are your early memories of Vince Sr.?
Vince Sr. You know, he was a classy guy, the old man. He was, when I was growing up and you watched all the movies and the films and when you met Vince Sr., he fit right into the cliche of what a promoter was back in those days. He was always, well dressed, and he had the white kind of wavy hair, and he had an idiosyncrasy. He'd always have like 4 or 5 quarters in his hand, and as he'd walk around, he'd be, kind of like jingling these quarters.
I heard about that.
Yeah, and he'd always have, usually like Skolin maybe around him or somebody to do his bidding. But he was a smooth guy, and he was an elegant-looking figure. And it wasn't until later, down into the late 70s, that I found out more about it. But he was a classy guy, the old man.
Was Vince Jr. starting to get more political power there? And were you like a Vince Jr. guy, or did Vince Sr. like you more?
They both hated me.
Who was more for the angle, though?
Well, I'll tell you, here's the thing. It's kind of more developed in my book, the whole story about this. But back then, the McMahons, like Junior is today, they're great promoters. If you can get yourself over, if you can develop a character that people will buy, the McMahons can promote you. They don't know how to create you. And back then, it was a pretty stereotyped, cliche formula for professional wrestling. You had Bruno, who was the champ, 260, 70-pound guy. So to the McMahons, the opponent had to be a 300-pound. That's why all the guys were always so big. Koloff was 300 pounds. Billy Graham, George Steele was 300 pounds. Tanaka. I mean, whoever Bruno was wrestling was usually a big guy because that was their basic formula. When we came along with this idea, the young protege stabbing Bruno in the back, who was about the same size as Bruno then because he trimmed down a little bit, the McMahons, they didn't believe in it. It didn't compute to them that Larry's not a 6'6" ugly brute. How can this possibly work? So they didn't know. And then, but then they got to, that got kind of shoved out later. But back then, that's how you wound up with the Backlund thing in there too, because Bruno ran so much when he retired. The McMahons kind of resented the fact that even though they were the promoters, they didn't have control. The machine was run by Bruno because whoever he wrestled went up the ladder, wrestled him, and then went down. So it was really Junior in the early 80s that was getting more politically strong because he was the one that wanted Backlund. And that's how he is today. I mean, if the fans say, we don't want this guy, McMahon is going to say, I don't care. This is the guy. I like him. So,
right.
And they're still, dealing with that today. But that's when it would start back in the early 80s. That's how the structure was. I mean, the way the structure was, the champion would get the most money.
Right.
And the guy who wrestled the champion would get almost as much, but not as quite. And then the semi-main would get maybe half or better than what the main event made. See, it was a weird structure. I mean, if you were the main event at Madison Square Garden, you'd make $6,000 for the night. Back in the 70s. If you were the opening bout, you'd make $150. If you wrestled for Vern Gagne and you were the main event in St. Paul Civic Center, you'd probably make the same $6,000. But if you were the opening bout at the St. Paul Civic Center, you'd make $1,500.
Right.
It was a bit different.
Oh, wow.
It was different. Some guys were much better payoff guys than other guys.
So Vince Sr. probably wasn't the greatest payoff guy for the underneath.
No, for the underneath, he wasn't a great payoff guy. They took care of their top guys. But their structure was different, too. They had some more partners involved. When you run the Garden, Vince Sr., his money, that was his town, the Garden. He lived month to month off the Garden. And the only reason he could live month to month was because every month Bruno sold it out.
Right.
But, the Garden, the Garden would take 50% of up to so much and then 70% more. You got New York City tax, New York State tax. God knows how many unions and that state athletic commissions. So by the time you got done with the Garden, it wasn't,
Why do you think they kept the belt on Backlund for 6 years? I mean, after Shea Stadium was 80, that was his second year, and it was not going anywhere.
I can't tell you. I don't know. The only reason I know why they did it was because Vince Jr. liked Backlund.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only reason. It didn't matter if he drew money. It didn't matter. For some reason, I don't know why, but Vince Jr. liked Bob. So Bob had the belt.
Did you like working Bob Backlund?
Yeah, I had a great time. Bob was a wrestler. So me and Bob, could get in the ring and have good matches because we both had kind of the same style, or we could do the same, kind of match. Oh, the Valiant Brothers, they were classics. Wrestling the Valiant Brothers was a night off in those days because wrestling was very simple. But the most important thing about the wrestling, which was there in those days and not here in these days, is the emotion. And the Valiant Brothers had heat. And whether it was the Valiant Brothers or anybody, when they had heat, the match was a done deal. It was a great match before you even got in the ring because the people were ready for it. The Valiants were basically very easy to work with. Jimmy could do nothing. He just ran around the ropes, but then Johnny took a couple of good bumps, and they had their little thing. But it was very easy to work with them because they had heat. Today, the guys don't get heat, and they're killing themselves. And the crowd just kind of sits there, and if someone does like a really big, gigantic bump and falls through 3 tables, they'll go, yay! And then they'll just sit there and wait for something else. Because in the meantime, so what? But it was so phenomenal easy back then. I guess that's why a guy like me at 54 years old can still wrestle, because we could have matches for an hour, and the crowd would go nuts. But you didn't have to kill yourself. You had to be in good shape, and you had to know some stuff. You had to know the psychology, but it had nothing to do with diving 30 feet into, fluorescent bulbs full of thumbtacks. So it was great.
What are your memories about wrestling Billy Graham, the superstar?
Very short. I didn't wrestle Billy Graham much. I wrestled Billy Graham maybe a couple of times. And in fact, when Billy came in, it was kind of at the point, I think Backlund had the belt then. And I was kind of in the middle of, getting ready to do the Bruno thing. And I wrestled Billy a couple times, but Billy was very flamboyant, a great showman, great talker. And, he looked outrageous for the time. He was one of the first of the steroid babies that showed up. And Billy never went long because he couldn't do anything.
Right.
He wasn't a wrestler. He didn't know. But he was smart enough to know what to do for his character. And because of the way the fans were, and the heat was, again, Billy was someone that had heat and attention. So if you did nothing for 5 minutes but Billy walk around flexing and you get ready to go, and you gave Billy, one arm drag, which he could take and then fall and tangle himself in the ropes, you could blow the roof off the place.
Oh, yeah.
So, they were short and sweet with Billy Graham. Back in those days, it was kind of being in awe of things because you want to make it to the big time. And a guy like me, because I was young, but because Bruno was my mentor, and Bruno was the guy that told the McMahons, "Hey, I'm bringing this kid in as my protege," and the McMahons, who would normally not even look at me, would say, "Oh, great, Bruno." So I remember the first time I think I drove across from Pittsburgh, and I had my first little show somewhere around Cherry Hill, New Jersey.
Right.
And I remember driving there, and I was real excited. I met Tony Gurria there and some other people, and they were all really nice to me, the Bruno. And had a show there. I really don't remember much about the show, but after that show, I drove up to Connecticut. And I was going to, rendezvous with Tony up there, and then we were going to start doing some things. And I'll never forget that night, because driving up for the first time from New Jersey up into Connecticut, I was by myself. I'm a professional wrestler. I'm like 21. I got myself a new car, and I'm driving down the turnpike. And it's the first time I saw New York City. And you see the skyline, and you're just kind of driving by yourself. And it was a feeling of stepping out of your childhood and that childhood dream you had. Now I'm thinking to myself, I'm a professional wrestler. I'm driving past New York City. It's like 2 a.m. No one's around. You see the skyline up there, and it's kind of like the dream's calling you. It's like, hey, you're in New York City and you're Bruno's protege. I mean, I didn't realize how cool it was going to be.
Right.
But I was, awestruck by the fact that, the little kid I was, which seemed like yesterday, I'm now driving, my car across New York City by myself, becoming a man, and starting this profession which I dreamed about. So it was a feeling I'll never forget that night.
What led you to leaving the WWF?
They didn't want to pay me, so I left. Well, now, you know what? It was weird because after the Bruno thing, I still had a lot of heat on me.
Right.
And of course, the McMahons were up to their games, where promoters had funny games back then. If you were promised a 3-shot program like in the Garden, to you it was good because it meant money. You went, hey, I'm going to make 3 main events. Boy, these 3 months, I'm going to make 20 grand just in that one shot.
Right.
Back in those days. So, but again, promoters get resentful. The McMahons at this time, because Bruno ran it for so long, Vince Jr. especially, wanted the power. He wanted the control over his own business, which wasn't bad in theory. It's your business.
Right.
You should have control, but do you want to have control so you make money, or do you just want to have control so you lose money but you're the boss? But I forgot the damn question.
I was just asking you what led you leaving the WWF.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was basically, the thing was over, and they were trying to, get revenge on me for standing up for myself. So they would pull stuff like, I'd drive to Boston Garden, where I had a program set up to wrestle Morales.
Right.
After the Bruno thing. So it was supposed to be me and Morales for 3 months, in Boston.
Right.
So then I get to the arena, and Angelo Savoldi would come up and say, oh, well, this is great, but Vince changed it. He just wants Morales to beat you.
Uh-huh.
So right away I would go, ding, 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 ding. Oh, they're trying to give me the shaft trick. It's not 3 shots. Because in those days, if Morales beat me,
you're done.
I'm done.
Right.
It ain't coming back next month. People don't care. They've seen the payoff. So I was ready for them. I said to Angelo, and this happens some other times with Monsoon. This is all in my book, how this works.
Right.
So I said to Angelo, I says, hey, look at I didn't tell him that, I know it's the swerve job. I said, look at I can't let Morales beat me because Bruno never beat me. And that way, you'll make Bruno look bad. And Bruno was so powerful in those days that all Savoldi and McMahon, all they can say is, well, that's right, because Bruno never beat me.
Right.
He did it on purpose. And I could always use that against the powers to be because they couldn't argue with that.
Right.
That's how strong he was.
Would you have, if you would have stayed in The Money Is Right, do you think, where was the program Bruno going? Maybe eventually you guys came back together. Do you think that's one thing you would have liked to done? Were you turned back with Bruno to go against whomever?
Well, that would have been a classic ending.
Do you think there was still more money to be made with Larry Zbyszko?
Oh yeah, there was a lot. It was just a time when Bruno didn't want to do any more wrestling, and the McMahons and him. I mean, they just didn't get along. I was kind of in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And but then again, I wasn't going to do what I had to do to get along with the McMahons, which in those days was kiss butt and take roids and get huge and dance around and do everything I was really taught not to believe in. I mean, Bruno was horrified when, at first everything got over really big because of NBC, but then they make videos where the good guys and the bad guys were all in the same music video.
Right.
Bruno, and then they were horrified. It was breaking the code because we were sitting there going, oh God, how can you have a feud with Piper and this guy? Now they're both in the same music video. It was like wrestling was selling its soul to have a thing on MTV. Who gives a shit?
Right.
We're bigger without them.
Right.
And stuff like that. But
TitleMatchNetwork.com